Is it is there any doubt in your mind that our enemies, foreign enemy nations, are attempting to dismantle American critical infrastructure? And one of the ways that they are attempting to do it is through the purchase of immovable property in some cases that is close to critical infrastructure facilities. I mean, is that a explicit purpose that they have?
The answer is yes, and it's worse than that. I have more bad news. Wait, put that checkbook away. Here's the worst news. For the first time ever, we now have criminal organizations that have net worths far in excess of many nations that would like to cause us harm. The drug world has been very rewarding. And so it's now worse than just Iran. It's worse than elements in Syria. It's worse than the Russians. It's worse even than the Chinese. It's the fact that there are groups that are not a part of the United Nations or others who would cluck their tongues and say that's not good. That's what makes them harder to track. What would you do if you had billions and billions of dollars at your disposal? And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing today that perhaps we've not seen in the same way in the past.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us once again on the State of Freedom.
Good morning. Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to the State of Freedom. We are coming to you live from Voice of the People USA Radio, Rumble, X, YouTube, and Facebook. If you're catching us later on Spotify or podcast or some other app, we're just happy that you're here listening to us. I'm Danielle Walker, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Alexander. And today we're going to be digging into a topic that we covered very closely this past legislative session, and that is the protection of state land from foreign adversaries, particularly near military installations. And joining us for that discussion today, we're so pleased to have Nebraska State Senator Brian Hardin, because he has firsthand experience in dealing with this issue up close and personal. So we will be getting into that. Before we do, let me read the scripture of the day. And if I have my Bible handy, which I do, okay. Today is Romans chapter 6, verses 7 through 11. Let me see. One page over. Sorry, folks. Okay. It says, "Could it be any clearer that our former identity is now and forever deprived of its power? For we were co-crucified with him to dismantle the stronghold of sin within us, so that we would not continue to live one moment longer submitted to sin's power. Obviously, a dead person is incapable of sinning, and if we were co-crucified with the Anointed One, we know that we will also share in the fullness of his life. And we know that since the Anointed One has been raised from the dead to die no more, his resurrection life has vanquished death, and its power over him is finished. For by his sacrifice he died to sin's power once and for all, but he now lives continuously for the Father's pleasure. So let it be the same way with you. Since you are now joined with him, you must continually view yourselves as dead and unresponsive to sin's appeal while living daily for God's pleasure in union with Jesus, the Anointed One." And the Lord's been talking to me a lot about yielding to his voice and living in submission to him. This is the lifelong practice of a follower of Jesus. And it's getting the old dead inner man's desires out, that inner man who was crucified with Christ, and aligning the new inner man, the one who was resurrected with Christ, to align and stay aligned with the instruction with the written word of God and the promptings of Holy Spirit who lives within us. So let me encourage us all today to make our North Star this week the aim to do exactly what verse 11 says, and that is to live daily for God's pleasure in union with Jesus, the Anointed One.
You know what, Danielle?
Chris,
It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to, consider ourselves dead. And the interesting thing about considering ourselves dead is that's really when we come alive, because it's hard for Christ to come in and penetrate us with his grace when we got the fat of the ego and the pride and everything else within us. It's a daily process, a daily effort, a lifelong process, really, to kill the ego so that we can flourish with pursuing things that are really larger than ourselves and that serve the broader politic. There could be a lot of selfishness in politics, and really, for people who want to do God's will and do good work, can be a daily crucifixion. And as someone who probably knows something about that, being in politics now for quite some time now, is State Senator Brian Hardin, as you said, from Nebraska, here to talk to us today about some really important issues related to foreign purchase of property here and elsewhere. Senator Hardin, thanks for taking the time to join us on the State of Freedom for a little while, sir.
What I think is even more relevant when you're talking about politics is what Paul writes right after that when he says, "The thing I want to do, I don't do. The thing I don't want to do, I'm really good at that."
Yeah.
We
Oh,
see
I
that on
love it.
full display in the Louisiana legislature. I don't know if that's how it plays out in Nebraska.
Yeah, and it's
It
not
does.
it's not limited to the legislature.
No, it's
I can
not.
tell you that. But anyway,
Yes.
Senator Hardin, you're also a pastor, right?
Well, I used to be a vocational pastor, but I would say that ministry never ends. So, yes, I became a pastor many years ago in the land of Pennsylvania. And so that's not where Dracula is from. That's out on the eastern side of the country. And so was in vocational ministry for a number of years, but have actually been out of that world for 25 years.
Yeah. Well,
So,
you're in like you
and
said,
that's when
ministry never
ministry got
ends.
really hard. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You got to deal with the
Believe me,
real people.
I'm sure the Nebraska legislature is fertile ground. Politics generally is fertile ground. Well, let's talk a little bit about immovable property and foreign purchase of immovable property. Just to set this up, a couple of years ago, we passed a law in Louisiana prohibiting anybody who is characterized as a prohibited foreign actor or foreign adversary, as defined by the U.S. State Department, from purchasing any immovable property anywhere in the state of Louisiana. And you have sponsored similar legislation in Nebraska, had a chance to look at it very briefly. And I believe that was in 2024. What prompted you, Senator Hardin, to bring that legislation in your state?
I would love to be able to say that I was very prescient and could see it coming. No, we were reacting. And so an attorney from my hometown, a friend of mine, happens to be a guy I go to church with, came to me and said, "We're seeing some strange developments." And in what way? And he said, "Well, we're seeing purchases of land, weird pieces of land. And by weird pieces of land, we are out where the Great Plains are. And so there are very large ranches and so on and so forth. And when there are, shall we say, dumpy little pieces of ground, maybe 16 acres in the middle of nowhere, no roads, no wells, nothing on them, but they were purchased. And so it gets more interesting when those purchases happen with actual cash in a briefcase. And so we're not the brightest bulbs on the Christmas tree, but when we see that a number of these start taking place and then start connecting the dots, let me tell you about the dots that were connected. Our area is somewhat unique because we have intercontinental ballistic missiles in my district. There are 3 missile fields in the United States. One of them is in western Nebraska. One's in North Dakota. One's in Montana. The one in my district actually goes across the state borders into northern Colorado and southeastern Wyoming. About 9,600 square miles of chocolatey goodness there. And so those ICBMs have been in place since the Nixon administration. It's time for an upgrade. And so they still work. They pluck a couple of those out of the ground every year, fire them out of Vandenberg. In fact, I've witnessed that. And it's just a way of showing the world that, look, they still work. And so if a missile comes out of Vandenberg, that tells our friends and our enemies that we're not about to remove you from the map. And so we've witnessed that ourselves. But the defense contractor had to publish a map because of easements. Certainly, these are all over the place. We're used to it. We're used to seeing the Air Force out there servicing those silos. And
For those of you who live in Louisiana, servitudes.
okay. And so, anyway, a lot of activity is starting to happen out there. This will be a very large decommissioning and a new system coming in. And so, interestingly, when you take a look at the map, that was related to the main cable line, related to these missiles that was proposed, and they had to publish this thing because of the fact that people have private property, and now the federal government is going to be traipsing across your land. And so they have to let them know. And this affects farms, this affects center pivots, this affects all kinds of things. And so, people were very interested and very concerned about the well-being of their families and so on and so forth. This will be a multi-year process. Then you start connecting the dots on some of these strange land sales that took place. There were several of them that actually were right on top of that published cable. And so purchases that were taking place in cash. So we notified Homeland Security and connected some of those dots for them and said, we need your help. And of course, we notified the Air Force, we notified the FBI, and said we could really use your help because we're in over our pay grade. And so then started about a 1 year long process to try to put legislation in place.
If you're looking to invest in physical precious metals or convert your 401k to a precious metals backed IRA, please consider making your investment with our trusted partner, Metal Stacks. Their prices regularly beat the big sites and they have no credit card fees or minimums. Shipping is free for orders over $500. Just visit metalstacks.com/dwalker or get there from our website, freedomstate.us. If you're interested in the IRA conversion, drop me a message at Danielle at freedomstate.us and I can get you connected with their white glove service. And Brian, when you talk about some of those properties, when you and I talked off air before this, you mentioned that there were some things that were being done that were pretty nefarious that looked on their face like they may be great investments. Would you talk about that a little bit? What you found? It may not be specifically connected to Vandenberg, but some of the other bases that are close to your district.
Our district has, I should say, the missile field is actually being shepherded by Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne. And so, interestingly, in Cheyenne itself, and you can look these articles up online, but the Cheyenne world, that's the capital in Wyoming, has kept a close eye on essentially activities that were nefarious going on in and around Warren Air Force Base. Warren in the 90th Missile Wing is essentially in charge of what's going on with this missile field. There's a little town in my district called Kimball. 2,400 amazing people live there, and it's kind of the middle of this big missile field. And so many times it's referred to as the Kimball Field. And so there were actually businesses that were put out of business by the FBI in August of 2024 that were in close proximity to Warren Air Force Base. And so it was determined that there was unfortunate activity going on. One of the things that I learned in this process is that espionage and sabotage in the 21st century is not the good old-fashioned world of the Soviets coming in and spying in a way where they grow someone up inside your ranks from the time that they're 2 years old and then they turn and it's a big surprise for everyone at the end of the story. Things happen differently in the 21st century. And three of the ingredients in that espionage cake to look for are large amounts of electricity that are developed and then used by buildings full of supercomputers. Those could be used for data centers. Those could be used for crypto mining, blockchain. And many times those could be used not just for those activities, but actually for spying on something that is the third part of the recipe, which is being in close proximity to your target.
Yeah. Brian, the businesses that were shut down, that were in close proximity to Warren Air Force Base, do you know what the nature of those businesses were?
One was a crypto mining
Okay.
operation, and another was a tech-related business. And so one was North Korean, one was Chinese.
Yeah.
Wow.
And is that because the federal authorities or the FBI discovered actual nefarious activity, or did they do it because they were concerned about the potential for nefarious activity? What was the basis of the closures?
My understanding is both and. And so I salute Wyoming Secretary of State Chuck Gray because I had a few conversations with Chuck and his staff over the last few years. And Wyoming, as you know, has long had discrete LLCs. So has Delaware. There are 4 other states that do the same thing, and there are advantages to having discrete LLCs. Like anything else, a hammer is a tool, and it can be used for building a house. It could be used for committing murder. And so it's a tool in the business world. And in this case, there were LLCs that owned LLCs that owned LLCs, and they're discrete. That means, in plain language, you can't see who owns them. And
Yeah,
so
it's
those
very,
LLCs can run businesses, own assets, and so on and so forth. And so I remember talking with Chuck and saying, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "I think I'm going to dissolve them." And I said, "Can you do that?" And he goes, "We're about to find out." And so anyway, he said if they don't like it, they're going to show up to court
yeah,
and sue
That's
sure.
me.
right.
And so it literally was the kind of thing where he had to take some extreme measures to protect Wyoming, and I appreciate it because we're right next door.
Yeah. I'm intrigued, Brian, about the nature of the purchases that raised your initial suspicion. When you say that these are cash purchases, you're talking about literally, you know, I don't know what the value of this immovable property is, but I imagine you could be talking about anywhere between hundreds of thousands of dollars and potentially millions of dollars in cash for the purchase of this property.
In this case, these were little pieces of ground, and when you're talking just acres, it makes sense to buy certain pieces of ground and doesn't make sense to buy certain pieces of ground. So, we're the wide open West. And so these were small pieces of ground for the most part, maybe as small as 15, 20, 25 acres, maybe 45 acres, maybe 125 acres. So it's not a lot of ground in our world. And this is usually acreage that sells for maybe $700 an acre. And one of the suspicious things was that it was a purchase of significantly more than that
Hmm.
per acre. And so it really never got into the millions, but it's a piece of ground that might be worth, $25,000, but it
Oh,
sells
okay.
for 60. And they actually showed up with a briefcase of Benjamins.
Wow. Yeah, that's enough to raise a little suspicion. It's certainly not the conventional way of transacting on a movable property.
And then
Yeah.
when it happens more than once, and because at the end of the day, in order for this thing to be legal, right, and to change hands, it has to flow through the county. And so then you look at some of this information and go, all right, that's now the second time, the third time, the fourth time we've seen that. Oh, isn't this interesting? And many of these purchases are right on this published
Yeah. And
line,
Yeah.
Your bill in Nebraska that was passed prevents exactly what we're talking about here.
right? But what it does, and keep in mind, right? All laws are a fence. Yeah, just like the laws in the Old Testament. A fence keeps things in, it keeps things out. And so could someone go do this and still go do this? Well, yeah, they don't. We've basically created a form and another line, if you will, a paragraph on an already existing real estate form that says, I'm not a bad guy. And so, really, what we did was pass a law that was a tripwire that says, if you trip the wire, we're going to find you. You know that piece of going out and buying a gun that says, do you intend to use this gun in the commission of a felony? And everybody chuckles at that point and goes, yes, yes, I am.
Right.
Well, we chuckle at that. That tripwire is the same type of thing this is. Are you intending to purchase this property and use it for nefarious purposes? And one of the interesting things is essentially coming up with that list. We used federal documentation to essentially come up with that list of bad countries that you mentioned a little while ago, Chris. But you can use OFAC, you can use others. For example, the Office of Foreign Asset Control through the U.S. Treasury, part of the State Department, essentially outlines, characters out there on the national scene. When we all hear these wonderful things in the news about sanctions, we're going to sanction Russia. We're going to sanction Iran. What's that mean? Well, that means go to ofac.gov. And that's where you can actually read about what the sanctions are. Those sanctions actually are never against the Iranian government. They're against Iranians who happen to own something here in America, or Russians who own businesses here in America. It's now we're going to clamp down on that business, that entity. Maybe there's an individual, but usually, once again, they're not stupid. They will use LLCs and other kinds of things. And so it takes an army of researchers to figure out who owns something in the real world.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, that's what that has to do with. Also, keep in mind when you pass a law, the list of bad guys can and will change over time. So you want to be a little bit careful about being too rigid. And frankly, we need to update these things as time marches on.
Yeah, one of the things I was really surprised and whenever we talked, Brian, was the fact that you said that you think about cyber espionage as being possible from anywhere, but you were
Yes.
explaining that the proximity to the military installation is actually an important part or a vital part of their ability to spy on these places. Would you talk about that a little bit? And are y'all doing any kind of additional scrutiny? I think, in Louisiana, we just, I think at the beginning of Jeff Landry's tenure, he signed a big deal with Google for an AI center in the north of the state. And I think about, here we are trying to drum up economic development, and some of these things look so good on their face. But one thing that is concerning is the stated owner. Okay, this is a Google AI center in the north of the state, so I'm not like so terribly concerned about that, because I imagine if it's got a Google brand, then Google has to stand behind it. But I think about a provision in your bill that says that anybody connected to a foreign adversary, because some of the stated people who are stated as owners of these massive data centers or AI centers may not actually be the real owners. I mean, it's not that hard to hide behind a nice, cheery looking lawful citizen and be a North Korean spy.
Well put. A third party people, straw men, as we call them in that real estate industry, right? And it doesn't mean that every straw man is always a bad guy out to seek to do us harm. I think it usually does. And so, in the case of what we saw, for example, in Cheyenne with this crypto operation, it was purchased by one group of people, and over time, those ownership shares shifted. And so it wasn't something that made headlines. It wasn't like it was a big purchase that made the front page of the newspaper. It was something that was gradual. And so we've known for a long time that China, for example, is more than glad to go out and find people from other places, frankly, even Americans. That's one of the hard things. Think about the DNA of an LLC for just a minute. This last year, we had the federal government saying, "Oh, we all need to do these documents, right, that we had to turn in." And they basically said, "This is who owns this organization, and anybody who owns 25% of an organization has to be reported." Well, the easy trick there is everybody owns 24%, and
That's
then
right.
some other wag owns a little bit. And so there's always ways of zigging and zagging with that. But the third party thing is something to keep an eye on, and it is difficult. But I look at it and say, perhaps the easy thing to do is keep an eye out for big energy projects. What's going to use a lot of electricity that's coming into your part of the world?
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that everything that's going to use a lot of electricity is bad in and of itself. It means scrutinize it, look
And
at
it's
it,
worth, and
and
it's certainly worth scrutinizing, Danielle and Brian, because I mean, it's this data center that you're talking about, Danielle, is located just within a few miles of a major Air Force base, Barksdale Air Force Base, in where I'm from, up in North Louisiana. So it certainly warrants scrutiny. And on your bill, Brian, as Danielle said, it is the language regarding the prohibited actors is broad, and I'm sure it's broad by intent. It says anybody who's affiliated with a foreign adversary, and you can certainly, as you're discussing, I mean that's very broad. Regarding the prohibition, it requires an affidavit, correct, from on the part of the buyer that they are not affiliated when they're buying this property, that they are not a prohibited foreign adversary and they're not affiliated with a prohibited foreign adversary. And I think it's important to point out that it does require a sworn document. Which is subject to the penalty of perjury. An affidavit carries, the penalty of perjury, just as though you're testifying in court. So I think that's important, that it requires an affidavit and not just a statement from the buyer.
at the moment of sale of that handgun, for example, and you say, "No, I don't intend to use this in the commission of a felony," of course not. It's when the felony happens, right? The felony itself is illegal, but you also lied to the feds way back when you bought that gun. You said, I'm not going to use this for a bad thing, and then you did. And so that's kind of how this works. And at the moment of the purchase, that's not going to stop it. The wall is not that high, but it's a tripwire. And it says, okay, we now have a legitimate legal means to go back and investigate things further. Not every handgun purchase results in someone being murdered, right? It could be a brandishment. It could be some kind of a threat that takes place. And so there certainly are things where you start to add up these various pieces and parts of, wait a minute, suitcases full of cash, strategic locations. They said they weren't from somewhere bad. Wait a minute. We're building a case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Brian, for the benefit of our listeners, is there any doubt in your mind, and this is partially rhetorical, but I want your response to it, that our enemies, foreign enemy nations, are attempting to dismantle American critical infrastructure? And one of the ways that they are attempting to do it is through the purchase of immovable property, in some cases that is close to critical infrastructure facilities. I mean, is that a explicit purpose that they have?
The answer is yes, and it's worse than that. I have more bad news. Wait, put that checkbook away. Here's the worst news. For the first time ever, we now have criminal organizations that have net worths far in excess of many nations that would like to cause us harm. The drug world has been very rewarding. And so it's now worse than just Iran. It's worse than elements in Syria. It's worse than the Russians. It's worse even than the Chinese. It's the fact that there are groups that are not a part of the United Nations or others who would cluck their tongues and say that's not good. That's what makes them harder to track. What would you do if you had billions and billions of dollars at your disposal? And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing today that perhaps we've not seen in the same way in the
Yeah.
past.
And because in that situation that you're talking about, Brian, it's they're not necessarily affiliated with a foreign adversary government. You're saying they could be Americans doing
They could
this.
be They could be Americans, they could be Canadians, they could be, again, you add in, sprinkle in the third party world, the straw man world, purchases, so on and so forth. And you also look at the fact that our enemies, particularly China, offers us a lot of lessons in patience. We tend to look at things in terms of the next 4 years in the presidency. They tend to look at things in terms of the next 400 years.
Great point.
Yeah.
Point. Yeah.
And Brian, you were telling me that a case in Arkansas kind of got this moving for you, inspired the kind of bill that you wanted to bring. Would you talk about what happened in Arkansas and how that should inform the way that we view some of these purchases and the way that we even view a way forward for bills that may protect our state?
It was October of 2023, and hats off to Arkansas, because they had what their own attorney general's office described to us as a rickety bill. And they said, this thing needs to be more robust, but it worked. It was the tripwire that worked. There was a takeover, a hostile takeover inside the ag world, and Syngenta Seeds essentially got acquired. Um, and it was a Chinese takeover. Well, this was not a military complex in Arkansas. It was basically a power plant. And there was 160 acres near this power plant. Thankfully, Governor Huckabee Sanders and her crew stepped up and said, wait a minute, let's stop this. That was the first time in the history of America foreign entity was required to reverse a real estate acquisition. And they had a rickety law, as they described it, that worked. And that's who we talked with and said, how do we do this right?
Yeah.
Moving forward. And they gave us some very good advice, which was go out and do this in multiple bills. Don't come up with one super bill that takes care of, let's protect all of our electrical infrastructure. Let's protect all of our dams. Let's protect all of our key highways. Let's protect our military bases. Let's just wrap it into one protect us all, because those bills will fail. Unfortunately, many states learned that the hard way. They came out and tried to do too much with one bill, and they failed.
Yeah.
we took a few bites at the apple that way, smaller bills, and I'm thankful to my fellow legislators. Senator Barry DeKay has brought other bills, as well as Senator Elliott Bostar. And so the three of us have brought a number of different bills all related to these kinds of subjects in order to make sure that the whole thing doesn't get tossed out because it's too broad.
Yeah. On the 160 acres in Arkansas, Brian, that was reversed, the deal that was reversed because of its proximity to this power plant. That deal was completely gone. I mean, done. The transaction had been completely finished. The
And
ownership had
they found
fully changed hands.
it was retroactive.
Okay, so it was retroactive. But the reason why I'm asking is because it kind of gets us into the issue of expropriation here. And I wanted to, first of all, tell you about a bill we had here and then ask you about what your thoughts are on this. This past session in Louisiana, Senator Valerie Hodge is a great senator from down here. Had a bill that would have allowed the Louisiana military to assess cybersecurity threats from any property located within 50 miles of a critical infrastructure facility in our state, property that is already owned by a foreign actor or a prohibited foreign adversary, and would have allowed, no matter when it was purchased, no matter how long it had been owned, to go back and assess the threat in that property and if necessary, go through a process of expropriation and reclaiming that property if they concluded that it posed a threat. Well, that bill was killed in our state Senate, unfortunately, because it was very straightforward. And as I told you a minute ago, the law in Louisiana is already prohibits the current acquisition of immovable property by a foreign adversary, but this would allow retroactive expropriation or reclaiming of the property based on that determination. So, my question to you is, what are your thoughts on the power of the state to expropriate property that is determined to pose a threat if it's owned by a foreign adversary?
Should a state? Yes. Do states? Not yet. And I think one of the reasons that we've all states have been a little bit timid has to do with what I was mentioning a moment ago about going broadly and why some of these broad bills fail. And when you get into the weeds on this stuff and you're starting to determine it, what do you do in a situation? For example, Chris, you've got an ownership of a scenario and you say, hey, it's the Chinese. The Chinese are doing this. Well, I have to sometimes explain to people, it's not like they come rolling up in a rickshaw with a
Yeah,
CCP checkbook on this stuff. It's an ownership group. It's the ABC
yeah,
LLC. Okay, well, even if it's not a discrete LLC and you can see who owns it, congratulations. It's owned by five different LLCs. Some of them might be discrete, some might not be. Or let's say it's completely transparent. And let's say there are four Americans and one Chinese guy. Again, it doesn't make the news when the Chinese guy buys out one of his partners and then buys out a second one and then buys out another one. Or frankly, the straw men have
Mhm.
always been serving the purposes of money.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so, hey, as long as you pay me well, I don't care. It's no skin off my back.
Well, I'll tell you my perspective, which is they should expropriate the land because if they land is not expropriated to me, and you guys can tell me if this is a wrong view on this, but the land becomes dead, right? Let's say, okay, they shut down this crypto operation. They're no longer allowed on the property. They're no longer allowed to operate the property. Maybe they go to jail. Okay, so what happens to the property? Does it just sit there? Is it just dead? It has no movement. Why couldn't the state just expropriate that and then auction it off and then use that as part of as tax relief for the rest of the citizens?
I think in plain language, they can, but again, you've got to have a legal means, rails for the train to run on. And so there's, I think, a real argument to be made for that. Part of it is, gosh, where do we find the army of researchers to determine that ownership? Frankly, even the feds feel that way. And that's why it's great that we have all of these things like discrete LLCs for various business purposes. The challenge is that once you have those kinds of tools in the toolkit, people can use them for these kinds of obfuscated purposes
Yeah.
that are bad. And so it takes a lot of time, even for the NSA and others, to kind of dig through it and figure this stuff out. And so it's very time intensive. And so I think one of the scary things is there's more of it than any of us realizes.
yeah. And I
And
think that's
so
the important, one of the important things to point out is that it absolutely is going on.
in Nebraska, there are, for example, when I was bringing this bill forward, and there's another that Senator DeKay brought again this year, there's a lot of pressure from a lot of our folks just to say no foreign ownership, period. It ends. There's 900,000 acres that's owned in Nebraska by Canadians. The Canadians are not on the naughty list anywhere. What if the Canadians were used as strawmen by Russia, as a for instance? And so the research that takes, and you knock one over, but you don't knock another one over. Are we dealing with potential discrimination situations? It does light a very dry field on fire when you start going down these roads, because these are old ruts in the road. These lands, I mean, the Italians, of all things, Italians own a whole bunch of land in Nebraska. The Italians? And so, anyway, it's one of those things where, can we just say foreigners in general? How do you undo, as you were saying retroactively, Chris, those kinds of commitments? Because the exchange of land and real estate is one of our most sacred trusts as a civil society. And so, is it really done? Or do we have to put the people to it to find out who owns something? You can see that it gets entangled quickly.
Sure, obviously, you're so right. It can be very, very difficult to distinguish the bad actors from the people who are not bad actors. And so, and you certainly want to get the bad guys, but you don't want to be in a position where you're hurting people whose intent is not nefarious. And I think that's very, very important. But I'm glad to hear you say, or suggest at least, that it's possible to find out who the bad guys are. Difficult, time consuming, probably very tedious, but possible to find out who the bad guys are.
And keep in mind, there's plenty of bad guys who are Americans
Yeah.
and who did buy the property without using a suitcase full of cash. And so espionage and other kinds of unfortunate activities are still illegal, even if they're done by people wearing Trump hats.
Yeah.
And so we still have lots of laws in place to stop those kinds of things. And so that's generally true. But yeah, and that's in the process of fighting this, and it's a process, right? It's a process to be in the fight. And part of that process is, yeah, let's use this list of keep an eye on anything related to China, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Venezuela with the Maduro regime, so on and so forth, Cuba.
Yeah.
There are some of them that have earned that opportunity to be on the naughty list.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
So,
you know what the
go ahead,
sad
Danielle.
thing is? I'm sorry, Chris. One
Go
of the
ahead.
sad things is a lot of these countries that are foreign, where we have foreign adversaries. You think Venezuela, or let's just say less adversarial, Colombia, Argentina. Their currencies in recent years have been so devalued. Their political situations have been so volatile that a lot of capital has flown here to protect the future of those people, those law-abiding Colombian citizens, Argentinian citizens, Venezuelan citizens' future, because they can just see that their money was completely destroyed. The value of their assets were completely destroyed. So I know people use the U.S. as a safe haven just for their own futures in terms of capital. But then on the other hand, you think about Uranium One, and that's coming kind of back into, I think, the public narrative with all of this declassification that's going on. And I don't know, at the time it was a fairly big scandal. But if you sit here and think about what's really happening, that the Chinese were allowed to purchase a uranium company, a mining company in the interior of the United States, and the deal was literally brokered by Hillary Clinton herself. That is one of the most astounding things I could possibly fathom in context of this conversation.
Glad to introduce you to people from Wyoming who were actually on the ground in the Powder River Basin when all of that was happening. And they can definitely give you an education and your listeners an inside track in terms of what that looked like as it was unfolding.
Yeah, that is
They
your.
still own it? Do you happen to know?
I believe that was a Russian purchase, and the
It was
answer
a
is
Russian
yes.
purchase. You're right. It was Russia. My
Yeah.
bad.
And my understanding is, oh, you betcha, they're not going to give up yellow cake.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that a case that Danielle's talking about that would be subject to legitimate expropriation?
Could be with the proper law. One of the challenges was, remember me bringing up that part about don't bite off too big a piece of the apple? Wyoming did that. And so they actually tried to pass a law, and it was a little too robust, and they struggled to get it through.
Yeah. Well,
That
we're
was
going
our
to certainly take
experience.
another shot at this one next year. There's no question about that. But I have to just to round this out, Brian, if we're in a situation where we've made a determination, or the military intelligence has made a determination, that property located within a certain proximity of a critical infrastructure facility is in fact owned by a foreign adversary or someone affiliated with a foreign adversary, as determined by the State Department, that property, in your view, would be subject to expropriation. You would be in support of that.
I'm in support of that. And I would also say a big piece of all of this, I work closely with Homeland Security, and they're really big on engaging the public because they know that these are big areas. The country's a big place. And if you see something, say something. In fact, they will bring those seminars, webinars, other kinds of things to locales where you're concerned about something like a power plant, something like a military complex. And it's great to have military intelligence, but they can't be everywhere. They're not omnipresent. And so they really do want and invite our help. And so in my area, we've hosted both live as well as webinar oriented situations where Homeland Security experts are welcoming this kind of interaction with communities. If you see something, say something. And it's not about them giving you a million ways that life can look weird. They'll say, look, you know your community. You know it
Yeah.
better than somebody that we will send out from DC. If you see something odd, you know it. Your internal spidey sense goes off and you go, that's not right. And if you see it, connect the dots for us. Let us know.
Yeah, that's so true. Most people look at this issue, Brian, and say, the average citizen looks at the issue and says, no, of course, it's a no-brainer. You know, you have these people who are enemies of the country, and they're trying to purchase immovable property. Of course, that should be prohibited. But I think that we have to be careful to make sure, again, that we don't sweep too broadly. And I think perhaps that's one of the reasons why, if, as you said, if you sweep too broadly, you get nothing.
You get nothing. And we
By the
also
way, I've got
value
to run
this.
and get my computer charger. I didn't realize it wasn't plugged in. Give me 1 second, but y'all go ahead. I can
Sure.
hear.
Okay. Well, we also value this weird thing, Danielle, called liberty. And so we don't like it. Somehow we have to find that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between getting government involved to protect us and darn it, we're Americans. And so we value this individual thing and our own autonomy. And yet we're up against some challenges here that are large. They're bigger than any one of us. And it's absolutely necessary to pray and to rely on God's providential hands, his sovereign hand. And God has also given us amazing tools. And so I'm very thankful in Nebraska for our state patrol. They're amazing. Our fusion center, that would be every state has its example of the fusion center, which is the interface from each state to Homeland Security. And so they've been instrumental in helping us do these see something, say something events and that kind of thing. Louisiana has that. They have their own fusion center. And as the fusion center guys will say, if you've seen 10 fusion centers, you've seen 10 fusion centers. None of them are alike.
Yeah.
So
Well, one thing I love about what you're saying is that this is, if it sounds like the Homeland Security has at least in your interaction with them in this issue, has a right view of the real role of government and the real role of local government versus federal government. I mean, we should be able to call on the federal government to help us, but we should be managing our own affairs at home.
we have stewardship as not only lawmakers, but just as citizens. Do you care about your community? If you do, this is shocking. And in fact, in my area, we're used to being around these intercontinental ballistic missiles. Again, they've been around for 50 some years. And so we're used to the Air Force coming out and doing their thing, and there are people inside those silos. The silos are spread out here and there and throughout the farming areas, ranching areas. We're used to being around all of that. But it's quite another thing. And when you talk to the old timers, they'll talk about the shock of what it was like 50 some years ago when this was new for us. And it was, gosh, we don't like this. We don't trust this. And, after 50 years, you go, yep. And now we're used to it. And so we're, I think, going through one of those chapters in history again, not just because of the grade of what is called the Sentinel missile system, but because that's where the world is today. We have threats to our electrical infrastructure that we've never had before. What does life look like? In fact, anybody who goes through a harsh weather event gets a few days or a few weeks, North Carolina, Florida, right, Texas recently, of how life gets upended. And no matter how hard we work, we're terribly energy dependent.
Yeah.
So we have to be mindful of those things.
The secret to losing weight 2 times faster has gone viral. See the transformations hundreds of thousands of men, women, and teens are experiencing around the world with the Slenderize drops. These homeopathic hormone balancing drops are proven to control appetite, support thyroid function, improve energy, boost mood, and increase metabolic rate. To learn more about the drops or other incredible natural wellness and lifestyle products, email me at danielle@freedomstate.us or visit the Shop Our Partners page at freedomstate.us.
Yeah. What's your plan for the next session in Nebraska?
Well, there are a number of things going on. In 2023, we threw out Huawei. So they basically, a lot of Huawei equipment was used throughout cell towers and that kind of thing. So we tossed them out. Each of the last 3 years, either myself or the other 2 senators I suggested have brought something in that way. We're going to continue the fight in terms of shoring it up piece by piece. And believe me, I like to do things now, fast. I stand in front of the microwave and jump up and down and yell at it. And so I like, immediate gratification. And so it all moves too slow for me. But those are the kinds of things that, you have to continue to nibble at. Every legislature has to deal with these kind of things. And Nebraska, in some ways, has a little easier. We are the only unicameral in the country. We have one house, not two. And so we still have to get 33 votes. If you don't have 33 votes, you're not going to get something passed. And so it still comes down to, convincing people. I've got to go convince 32 other people this is a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, and in the case of this bill that we've been talking about today, you were successful in that endeavor.
I don't think there were, in Nebraska, we have to go through 3 rounds of debate. And so it has to pass 3 times.
Mm.
And so I don't think there was ever any vote against it.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome.
You talked about if you see something, say something. Fine. Drilling down on that for a second. You're talking about ordinary, everyday, in your case, Nebraska citizens who
Yes.
see things or observe things that look suspicious.
Yes.
That can be a massive, important deal for people to take the time to report things that they see that look suspicious to them.
If you sit on your hands and you wait just for law enforcement to do it, or you say FBI, NSA, they've got this all figured out, they'll do it. No,
Yeah.
they need our help. And so one of the reasons I've really enjoyed working with Homeland is, to be very honest, the FBI is extremely tight-lipped. So is OSI from the military. Very tight-lipped. Thank you for the information. Was it meaningful? Thank you for the information. Homeland has been, on the other hand, thank you. We need these kinds of pieces of information. It helps us connect dots for things. They'll interact with you a little bit. They don't tell me what they know. I don't need to know what they know. Believe me, I don't want to know what they know. But they definitely need our help. Again, I pointed out that this missile field that we call the Kimball Field is 9,600 square miles. A lot of those areas don't even have 1 person per square mile in them. And yet, this is where the backbone of the defense of the nation is located, by the way. Do you know why we need those land-based missiles? Why they're so important? We would probably deliver a nuke through the air or through the water, right? A sub, a destroyer, an airplane. But the reason we still need the land-based world is because of a sucker punch.
Mm.
It's one thing when we understand that, hey, it's heating up in this part of the world, and so we begin to maneuver our Navy closer to where the hot spot is going on. That can take weeks. But what happens when you get sucker punched from somewhere you didn't see it coming?
Mm-hmm.
That's what the land-based situation is about, is trust your neighbors and lock your doors.
Yeah.
And so it just means that we can hit anywhere in the world in minutes. We don't need to move aircraft carriers and support groups 3 weeks and through the Panama Canal to get there.
Yeah.
That's what this is about.
And Brian, for a second, can you take me back? Who conducted the survey of all of the properties surrounding the base? You mentioned, was it the federal government that had to initiate that, or was it the localities?
Do you mean what we found in terms of these weird little pieces of property that were on the
Yeah,
line, as we
when they
call
were
it?
exactly.
Well, we have a local attorney who essentially services counties and some of these little towns, who is an individual attorney who was just hired on retainer to do civil work. And he noticed that that was a weird purchase that just took place inside our county and for a weird little piece of real estate. Okay, file that over here. Then add to it that there were more. And so he starts connecting the dots and going, what in the world is going on here?
And made in cash, often made in cash.
And so it takes that type of person who's willing to go, this is odd, right? And so you go share it with someone. So I would love to say, you know what, I could see this coming from a light year away. No, had it not been for this very conscientious local civil servant, if you will, I would.
And Brian, we lost you for a second, but we can hold on. We can't hear you. Can you hear us, Brian?
Lose you? Sorry.
Yeah, we
Okay.
got you back.
Okay.
Sorry.
So what you're saying, Brian? So this is just a real call to action. This is something that very important for Louisiana citizens to be aware of. Local attorneys, everybody to be on the
Title
lookout.
agents,
Title agents.
notaries.
Oh well, great point, Danielle. Everybody to understand, because we're all operating under the correct premise, as Brian has affirmed here, that we have bad actors and bad enemies of our country and of our state who really want to destroy us. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic by saying that. And one of the ways that they are trying to do that is through acquiring immovable property. So, Brian, we applaud you for bringing that bill on behalf of your state, getting it through. And we're doing similar things down here in Louisiana. And we look forward to working with you going forward, and maybe looking at some of your draft language and seeing what we can steal from you up there.
Glad to share what we've learned. I was, as I mentioned, deeply indebted to the Attorney General's office in Arkansas, and that's really what it takes, is states working together and saying, hey, we learned a hard lesson this way or that way, and don't repeat it. And so it really does take that cooperation.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, sir. You're always welcome, obviously, down here in Louisiana. We'll treat you well if you ever get down here, and we hope to get you back on at some point in the future.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Awesome. God bless you, Brian. The State of Freedom is a listener-supported podcast. We're committed to pursuing the truth about policymaking, decisions, and situations in Louisiana and at the national level that stand to impact our freedoms.
Please become a monthly supporter of the State of Freedom at freedomstate.us as we continue to expand the voice of liberty across Louisiana and beyond.
Thanks for joining us today on the State of Freedom. Be sure and check out the show notes for this episode. You can always go there and find the calls to action and resources mentioned in the show, and you can find out more information about our advertisers there as well. If you want to learn more about us or support our work, visit freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org. We'll see you next time. God bless.